When Nehemiah criticizes the Jews of his generation for their failures as Jews, he points to three shortcomings. One is rampant Chil Shabbos. The second is intermarriage. And the third is their failure to speak in the Hebrew language. Uveneim chatzi medaber Ashdodis, ve'enam makirim ledaber Yehudis, v'chilshon am va'am. The people of Yerushalayim, they spoke the language of the other nations, and they were ignorant of the language of the Jews. I take it as uncontroversial that most of the people in this room can't converse fluently in Hebrew. That sound right? Raise your hand if that sounds right. Almost unanimous. Uriel Sussman tells me, I'm not sure if Uriel's here, as the editor of the Beis Yitzchak, that he's having difficulty editing even some of the articles of the Rebbeim in the yeshiva because of basic lack of command of the Hebrew language. It's no secret here at Yeshiva University that this veritable institution recently gutted its Hebrew departments and cut down its Hebrew language requirements. And if you look at the burgeoning YU press at the Sfarim sale, there's a lot of books that are coming out in English. It's a bit of a travesty. And it's the diagnosis that Nehemiah made, that back in his generation, of Jews who are Einam Makirim Ledaber Yehudis V'chilshon Am V'am. It's not unique to our institution. It's American Jewry more broadly. Doesn't escape the Orthodox community either. You should read Cole Aronson's article in Mosaic called Why Can't the Jews Teach Their Children How to Speak Hebrew? And it's a survey of all the bastions of Orthodoxy, the high schools, the elementary schools, that it seems like nobody could get their language, their Hebrew language skills together. And I won't recommend watching, but Beremiza, if you were to watch Elon Gold's routine about his trips to Israel, that the only reason why he can't speak Hebrew is because he spent 18 years in yeshiva education. And this is familiar to all of us. I want to spend the next few minutes explaining why it's so important that we learn Hebrew and that we speak Hebrew and that we raise the quality of the Hebrew education, not just here at Yeshiva University, but across the community that we're participants in. And I want to survey four virtues, four elements, four aspects of why it's so important that we get our act together regarding Hebrew. The Tosefta in Maseches Chagiga writes that when a child is of age to do talis, lulav, tefillin, a parent is obligated to train the child in the mitzvos. And one of the things that the Tosefta records is that when the child is yodea ledaber, when he learns how to speak, when he's of age that he could converse, aviv milamdo shma v'torah v'lashon hakodesh. A father has the duty to teach his child the language of the Jewish people, the holy language. The Rambam writes in his Perusha Mishnayos to Avos, Havei zahir b'mitzvah kala kivachamura. The Rambam says, be careful with a mitzvah that looks trivial to you, but of course, in fact, it's as severe as all the chiyuvei kares. The example that the Rambam gives of a mitzvah that seems trivial to you, but in fact is not, it's lemidas lashon hakodesh. And I think this resonates with all of us here. It seems trivial and unimportant, but the Rambam says, Havei zahir b'mitzvah that appears kala kivachamura. The Torah T'mima argues the reason why learning Lashon HaKodesh is a mitzvah is because it's a hechsher for the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. There's no way to study Torah properly without understanding the language that the Torah is written in. Robert Frost quipped about translating poetry that there's only one thing that's lost in translation. You know what it is? The poem. And the same thing is true for Torah itself. You could try to translate the language of the Torah into some other language, but you're reading some muddled attempt to translate the Torah into some other term that it's not written in. And when language matters and when meaning matters, a person could only engage with it if it's their mind grinding directly on the concept that they're engaging with. Imagine a couple that's married for 30 years but could only converse through a translator. It'd be a shocking relationship to maintain. And the same is true with our Talmud Torah. To engage the text of the Torah via a translator, whether it's Koran or Art Scroll or choose your favorite translation, you're not engaging directly with the concept and the ideas of the Torah. The Ravid and the Meiri express this ideal well. Of course, the Meiri expresses every idea well. In Brachos Daf Yud Gimel, when they explain the view, quote the Ravid's formulation, Ein Adam Yotze Yidei V'Hagisa Bo Yomam B'Layla Ela B'Lashon HaKodesh. That a person doesn't fulfill their obligation of Talmud Torah if it's done through the mediation of some foreign language. And that's the idea that the Torah Tamima is suggesting, that understanding Lashon HaKodesh is a necessary requisite for engaging properly with Talmud Torah. But this is somewhat trivial and obvious to us. We know, and I know from teaching too many courses in Sims, that students who can't read Hebrew can't engage properly with the Jewish tradition. And this is going to be a problem for all of the generation of students who are being raised in our school system. But this is obvious, and you don't need me to stand here tonight to state the obvious. And it's also true that on this theory, the emphasis is on understanding and learning the language. But I want to move now to a second element, a second reason why Talmud Torah is important, why learning the Hebrew language is important. And here I want to argue that the emphasis is not on learning and understanding the language, but on conversing daily in the language. So not just to have knowledge of it, but to engage with your friends, to converse with them, dialogue in Lashon HaKodesh. The Sifrei writes in Parshas Ekev, V'limadetem osam es b'neichem, kishehatinok maschil ledaber, like the Tosefta, aviv midaber imo b'Lashon HaKodesh. Not like the Tosefta, which said he teaches his child Hebrew, but the father should speak and converse with his child in Hebrew when the child is able to converse. So here we have conversing in Hebrew as the father's obligation. The Shla writes in two places, one in Shabbos and one in Psachim. In Shabbos he writes that a Jew who converses on Shabbos should converse only in Lashon HaKodesh, Ki kadosh hayom la'adonenu, and zachar es yom HaShabbos lekadsho. That conversation in Hebrew is an elevated conversation, and so when a person converses on Shabbos consistent with the sanctity of the day, it should be in Lashon HaKodesh. My father's not here, and odds are he won't listen to this. So I'll just mention anecdotally that my parents tried speaking to us in Hebrew on Shabbosim, and it failed miserably. They did okay with some of us in learning Hebrew, but the project of speaking in Hebrew on Shabbos failed miserably. But the Shla's idea is that on a holy day we speak in Lashon HaKodesh, and he says a person should try to do this all days of the week if they can. And he writes in Psachim as well that when a person is standing next to someone who's deathly ill and their soul is about to depart, he says you should only speak to them in Hebrew because that's a language of Kedusha. And same for the Chola, him or herself. When he or she is conversing, Roi sheyidabru hakol b'lashon HaKodesh, v'lo b'lashon chol, ki kedusha gedola b'lashon HaKodesh. All of these speak to the virtue of conversing in the language of Hebrew and not in the language of chol. But I want to point to one makar that's the most striking of all these makoros, at least to me. The Shulchan Aruch writes in Siman Shin Zayin, in Hilchos Shabbos, that a person shouldn't waste away their Shabbos. They shouldn't fritter away the day of Shabbos reading Dvarim B'Telim. So you shouldn't read a novel, you shouldn't read history books on Shabbos. But the Ramah adds that that's only if it's B'Lashon Chol. Aval B'Lashon HaKodesh Shari. So if you're going to read a novel, if you're going to read Agnon on Shabbos, that's okay. But if you're going to read Philip Roth, Philip Roth's not okay even on Chol. But if you're going to read Dostoevsky on Shabbos, that's not okay. But if you're going to read Agnon, that's okay. Because it's written B'Lashon HaKodesh. What's so special about the book being written in B'lashon HaKodesh? The Magen Avraham explains two things. He says, number one, halashon ba'atzmo yesh bo kedusha. The language itself is holy, so you're engaged in some sanctified act simply by reading the words in Hebrew. And number two, here's the more striking claim, and this is what I want to focus on. V'lomed mimenu divrei Torah. You learn Torah simply from engaging with the language. What does that mean that you learn Torah from conversing or engaging in the language of Hebrew? I want to develop that idea for a moment. But first I want to point to another source that supports the same contention. Pashut Pshat in the Psukim, in Devarim Perek Yud Aleph, the Psukim of Hayam Shamoah, the Psukim say, V'samtem es Devarai Eila al levavchem v'al nafshechem. What's the subject of Devarai Eila? And the next pasuk, in pasuk Yites, V'limadetem osam es b'neichem ledaber bam. You should teach your children to speak in them. What does that mean? You should teach your children to speak in these words. So here the minhag is that we only talk in ksoses and nesivises and balamors and machamuses. Ledaber mam means that you're talking about whatever your Rebbe said in Shir that morning. B'divrei Torah. Rabbeinu Miyuchas, medieval commentator from Eretz Yavan, in a version actually published by our very own Rav Michael Katz, I believe. Rabbeinu Miyuchas writes, Ledaber bam, he quotes the Tosefta and the Sifrei, that when a child becomes old enough to speak, Aviv mesiach imo b'lashon hakodesh. Ein mikra yotze midei pshuto, v'debרת bam means you should speak in the language of the Torah. What's the language of the Torah? The Hebrew language, the words that constitute the meaning of the Torah, those are the words that you should speak in. And he says, Lamadnu shemitzvah ledaber b'lashon hakodesh. And he also cites the criticism in Nehemiah where Ezra criticizes Jewish people for lo yadu ledaber Yehudis. Says that was a violation of this injunction. Ledaber bam, to speak in the words of the Torah. Pashut Pshat it means speak in the words of the Torah, which means to speak in Hebrew. Mesiach imo b'lashon hakodesh. But how does that make sense? What does that mean that there is some sort of element of a ודברת bam, or as the Magen Avraham said, of lomed mimenu divrei Torah, simply by conversing in the language? So I want to give a few illustrations which might demonstrate this to be the case, or at least intuitively soften you to the idea that this may be true. You don't need to be experts in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which states that language molds the way we think. So part of the categories that we think in are framed by the words and categories of speech that we have. So the thesis is that when we think in the language of the Torah, when we think in the language of the Torah, we're thinking in the categories hewn by the Torah itself. I'll give you some very basic examples that the Medrash cites and Rabbi Yehuda Levi cites in the Kuzari. Adam is called Adam, why? Because he's taken min ha'adama. So every time you use the word Adam, you're pointing to this notion of man being formed from the Adama, which the Torah speaks about. Isha is called Isha, second parak of Bereshis, ki me'ish lukacha zos. So when you engage with those words, you're engaged with the meaning that the Torah attributes to them. I want to give another example where this is true, based off what the Rambam writes in Mor Nevuchim. The Rambam explains very famously that Lashon HaKodesh is Lashon HaKodesh because it lacks words for the categories that the Torah doesn't want you thinking or conversing in. So not only is it true that we are framed by the meaning of the context of the words that the Torah has, but it also means that the categories that we have at our disposal to contemplate in are restricted by the categories that the Torah wants us to think in and converse in. So there's an element here of lo mimenu divrei Torah that your cognition now is born out of the categories that the Torah wants you to be thinking in. Let me give you another example. I've thought about this example. I'll date myself, but I think I have a pretty good contemporary example that may resonate with all of you. Rabbi Yaakov Emden and the Chida separately, but they're brought together in the Shari Tshuva and Siman Pei Hey in Orach Chaim. They both argue that a Talmid Chacham or even a regular person shouldn't study Hebrew grammar in the bathroom. Since why you gutted Hebrew grammar, you don't really have that problem here. But in principle, you shouldn't do that in the Beis HaKisei. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden explains that the meaning of any word in Hebrew or any question of syntax or grammar in Hebrew can only be adjudicated on the basis of the usage of that word in its biblical or Mishnaic or Midrashic context. So anytime you're thinking deeply about the meaning of the words in Hebrew, you're automatically brought back to the original sources in which those words appear. So anytime you're thinking critically about any word or meaning or sentence in Hebrew, you're locked in to the context. In English, if you have a disagreement about the meaning of the word, you go, of course, to... So I'm dating myself, the Oxford English Dictionary, of course. And you find the original meaning of the word. Thank you. One person appreciated it. One person with a proper education here appreciated it. The Oxford English, and you find out that how did Dickens use the word? And how did Shakespeare use the word? And how is it modified by Hemingway? And so the meanings of the words is, of course, determined by the context of the writers who use them over the history of the language. Not so in Lashon HaKodesh. If you go to find the meaning of Lashon HaKodesh, you're brought directly back. Mishacham Shei Torah. Nevi'im, Ksuvim, the Mishnayos, the Tosefta, the Midrashim. That's where the meaning of the words is to be found. The Birchei Yosef, the Chida, writes that any Talmid Chacham who's writing a letter in Hebrew, and of course, perforce, he's going to be borrowing phrases from the Mishnah and the Gemara, just like you read Agnon and the words are borrowed from the Sifros of Chazal. There's no way to write a proper letter in Lashon HaKodesh without thinking of its contextual source in Kisvei HaKodesh, in Halacha, and in the halachic tradition. Okay, so here's my more contemporary example, since only two of us look to the Oxford English Dictionary. So, people like to use memes, right? A little slice of a movie show or a movie, and you'll send that in the context of a conversation, right? See that? But you're appealing to its meaning in the context of that television series or that movie that you watch. And so when you send that little snippet of The Office or Shtisel or whatever it is, you're referencing its meaning in that context. And that's the idea that Lashon HaKodesh, the meaning of the words and the concepts, is pulling. When you use those words in conversation, you're sending a little frame, a little clip from some pasuk in the Torah or some Mishnah in Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. This is the sense in which I think it's true that just by conversing in the language of Lashon HaKodesh, your categories of thoughts and the meaning that you're trying to convey, it's lo meid mimenu divrei Torah. Dr. Berger once remarked to me that he was in a certain Jewish day school, and I guess this itself speaks to the terrible state of Hebrew in Jewish day schools, that they wanted to honor the people who donated to the school, as schools like to do. So they had a huge picture of like all the names, and on top they had a quote from the Torah, like Kulam Anashim, like the great people. And Dr. Berger pointed out, like it was a quote from the Meraglim. So maybe it was done intentionally and then that school was super smart, or it was done unintentionally and that school was super dumb. But it's a great example where just the meaning of the pasuk is framed by its context in the Torah, or at least it ought to be. Even though my last name is Rosensweig, I'm going to actually wrap this up in the next 3 minutes. I want to quickly reference two other ideas associated with the importance of Lashon HaKodesh. The first one you'll recall is that it's a hechsher mitzvah for Talmud Torah, The second is that by conversing in the language, you are engaging at some low-level engagement with Talmud Torah itself. The third is from the idea of va'avdil eschem min ha'amim. The Jewish people are supposed to be separated from the other nations. And in fact, in the criticism in Nehemiah, the criticism that the Jewish people lost their mastery of Hebrew is in the same pasuk as the criticism of intermarriage, because they lost their identity altogether. And it's of course the fact that even Jews who didn't speak Hebrew over Jewish history, wherever they were, Jews always had a distinct language. In Eastern Europe, it was Yiddish. In Eastern Europe and pockets of Washington Heights, NYU, it's Yiddish. In other countries, it was Ladino. Still is today in parts of Seattle, apparently. And it was Judeo-Arabic for Jews who lived in Islamic lands. I mean, part of the cultural identity of Jews is always that we had a separate language, because language is one of the most distinctive markers of cultural identity. We know this very well from the Medrash in Vayikra of Lo Shinu es Shemam v'es Lishonam. Clearly, the idea of Lo Shinu es Lishonam is that the Jews kept to Lashon HaKodesh. The Smag writes in Mitzvahs Lo Saseh Simin Nun, under the mitzvah of Lo Laleches Bechukos Hagoyim, he writes, this is a major idea, Sheyehei Yisrael Muvdal Min Hagoyim B'malbush B'minhag U'v'dibur. That we should have our own language, and of course, that language should be the language of our Torah, the language of Lashon HaKodesh. So if we want to preserve the cultural distinctiveness of the Jewish people, then we ought to be embracing the language of the Jewish people, and not the language that we're all conversing in here, that I'm conversing in right now. I want to close with one final idea about Lashon HaKodesh, one that I think is more pressing and uniquely pressing today. Language has the remarkable power to either separate people or to bring them closer together. I'm sure you've all experienced being a Jew traveling abroad, finally can't speak the language, and you get to the shul or something and you could converse with somebody in Hebrew. It's an amazing feeling of camaraderie. Anybody have that feeling? Yeah. One time I was in Istanbul and I got to shul, and it's a crazy thing. No one there spoke Hebrew. There was no greater isolating moment in my life than that. You get to a shul of Jews and you speak to them in Hebrew and they look like you're speaking a foreign language. There's a quote that's attributed to Churchill, but probably not from him, that says, the United States and Great Britain are two countries separated by the same language. We could paraphrase that quote. The Jews are one nation separated by different languages. Jews in North America that speak English, we make a fool of ourselves when we go. You guys probably make a fool of yourself. No, we all make a fool of ourselves when we go to Israel and speak Hebrew. And of course, Israelis, when they come here and they try to speak English, it's almost a lack of kavod Torah. It's a lack of a kiddush Hashem that they struggle in English speaking to us. Some guys in my shir told me that a Rosh Hashiva came visiting from Israel, and I guess because no one in YU speaks Hebrew, they asked him to give a shir in English. And of course, he doesn't have the command of English. What a terrible chil Hashem that here at Yeshiva University we ask Hebrew-speaking Rosh Yeshiva from Eretz Yisrael to speak to us in English. Kilshon am ba'am. What a way to separate. What a way to drive a separation between this one nation. The Radak writes in Parshas Noach, the story of Migdal Bavel, that at the time all the Jews were all of the mankind was concentrated in one place. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew that in order to populate the world, you have to drive people apart. To drive people apart, you have to separate their languages. So the Migdal Bavel, HaKadosh Baruch Hu separated the languages, and that caused people by Hafitzeim Hashem al pnei kol haaretz. Language separates people and pushes them apart. The vision for Yemos HaMashiach, the Navi Tzania tells us, is Oz epoch el amim safa brura likro kulam b'shem Hashem. Metzudas David there explains that achdus halashon, unity of the language, unity behind the Hebrew language, will be the reason for people coming together, likro kulam b'shem Hashem. Rabbi say we can't give up on Lashon HaKodesh. Each of us should learn Hebrew. We should speak in Hebrew where we can. Bring Hebrew into your daily conversation. If you text your friends in Hebrew, if you're able to. Make sure that a veritable institution like Yeshiva University offers robust in-person courses in Hebrew, and that they're not just trying to shave a few dollars off their budget. Offer some more shiurim in Hebrew. Learn Torah in Hebrew. And when Rosh Yeshiva visit from Israel, of course, insist that their presentations should be in Hebrew. And when you graduate and mature from this institution, when you start sending your kids to yeshiva day schools, and you ask yourselves, like I asked, why you're shelling out so much money for subpar education, apologize to my kids' school. Insist that they offer a first-tier Hebrew instruction. My kids came home from their school. Hebrew was that schnitzel is schnitzel. This has got to be a priority for the Jews of the United States of America. And for those of you who are going to be principals and mechanchim, insist that the schools that you participate in provide the students with adequate education in Lashon HaKodesh. By doing so, we give everyone the gift of engagement with Torah, a hechsher for Talmud Torah. We allow that our conversations are framed by the categories of Torah. We create a cultural distinctiveness of Jewish people, va'avdil eschem min ha'amim. And I think we bring ourselves one step closer to the vision of Yemos HaMashiach of a Safa Brura Likro Kulanu B'Shem Hashem. Thank you.